Now we get to the fun stuff. How do we handle conflict? Conflict is interesting. So we're going to look at some approaches. We're going to look at gender, culture, and technology as it relates to conflict. So the 5 approaches that we're going to look at first are avoidance, accommodation, competition, reactivity, and collaboration. I think one of the things to mention first off is in the past, I really had a view about which one I think is best. I think in most cases there is one that's kind of works better than others, but there are times when I think all but one of these, all but one of these would have its place. Well, I guess I could actually think of a time when all of them would have a place. So I think when we're looking at these, it's not necessarily saying this one is the best. It's like looking at the situation and saying which one is the best in each given situation. So let's start by looking at avoidance. And avoidance is kind of pretending like it's not happening. I'm just going to ignore it and pretend like it's not happening. I think that's when maybe things aren't as communicative. So if someone's not saying something, but you can feel it, like you can feel that they're upset, you can feel that they're not happy. Those are pretty uncomfortable situations to be in, but there's people, if it's not spoken, then they can just avoid it. So that's one of the elements that sometimes people might take into consideration. But there's some techniques underneath of the avoidance technique that are kind of interesting. And the first one to look at is skirting. And this is a person that avoids conflict. And then what they might do is they're going to either change the topic or make jokes. Now, I've been known to make jokes about stuff, so if I don't feel like maybe it's important enough, I don't feel like dealing with it at that moment. There are times when I might choose this technique because it's not the right place or time to deal with the issue. So I think, again, situations can kind of determine which of these techniques might be used, approaches. Sniping is the communication and then leaving. So I'm going to drop some communication on you and then I'm going to walk away. So they're going to say some kind of negative thing and then just leave, walk out the door, and not interact any further with people. And so you'll see people that have this particular technique. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily particularly helpful, because the negative comments really don't leave you much place to go. And then the person's leaving, so they're not giving the other person an opportunity to respond back, which I think in some cases is the point. They're just gonna maybe just not interact with them any further. The challenge that we run into is this idea of cumulative annoyance, and that's where you have these repressed feelings and the irritation continues to grow, and then oftentimes they'll come out in one big burst, and then it's not great for the other person. It's not great for either situation and difficult to deal with and becomes more reactive. So I think, the idea is that just for the healthiness of the relationship and the healthiness of you, that you don't necessarily want to have stuff build up, but maybe find some healthy way to communicate it. And then pseudo conflict is that there isn't really a conflict, but the person might perceive that there is one, and there isn't really one. So I think people might do that in humor or in fun, but I don't, it's not healthy to engage in that just in general. And I think the idea is when you have emotions that are too high, that's a good time to employ avoidance. If you don't think that you can communicate in a way that's helpful, then you walk away. So I was studying something called Parenting with Love and Logic. And they teach parents when they're in a situation where they're really angry that you don't want to engage with your child at that moment. So you have the child go to their room and you calm yourself down, and then you figure out how you're going to deal with the situation. It doesn't necessarily work great for you to be in a high state of arousal and try to logically work something out. Because I don't know about you, but I can say for me, there are times when initially my answer is no or yes or whatever, and then I have a moment to think about it with a cooler head, or when I've had an opportunity to process the information, and I'm going to come back with a different answer. I think giving yourself some time to think some things through, that might be a good thing to do, or to observe, or to learn, or to process. I think sometimes avoiding can be helpful in those kinds of situations. Accommodation happens when one person gives in basically to the other person. A lot of times that happens when a person has more power, or that person has high concern for others and low concern for themselves. So sometimes this might happen with a parent. You know, sometimes parents might make those kinds of decisions where they're going to forego their needs in that moment to help take care of what their child needs in that moment. That might help happen situationally in relationships where they really want good things for their partner, so they might forego something to give to their partner. But probably not the best if it's happening all the time and only one person is accommodating and the other person isn't. That's kind of creating a little unevenness between the two people. So if accommodation's happening, it should only be happening in certain situations, and it shouldn't just be one person. It should happen with both. Competition. Competition is, I think, American culturally, it certainly happens here, is the idea that there's a difference between your goals and their goals. And there's this clash that happens in the pursuit of your own goals. I've seen it happen with men, like this is the way that they're supposed to deal with it, and so that's how they take it on. They get the big poofed up chest, and they do the eye contact thing and really kind of create this element of one-upsmanship, like I'm more guy-like than you. I don't know how that works, but oftentimes it's motivated by negative thoughts and beliefs. That might be a negative thoughts and beliefs about yourself. You know, like you don't feel like you're measuring up, you don't feel secure in the situation, so you might approach that situation more with competition, just because you don't feel like you're in control and you want to have control. So that can cause competition to show up because of the situation or circumstance. There is oftentimes a willingness to hurt others or lack of respect for the other person. They don't care that the other person might be feeling vulnerable in the other situation. They're okay with that. And oftentimes this can result in defensive communication where the other person's goals are dismissed, the other person's acting superior. They're going to kind of like squish the conversation, squish the upset because they have power over you. So they're gonna kind of yeah, we'll just go with squish the other person. And then oftentimes this causes an escalation and a rise in intensity, and it will create what we call like a loop, and it actually you can see it kind of escalating and getting bigger and bigger and larger and larger. And if nothing happens to interrupt that loop, then it oftentimes it will result in physical aggression or things like that. So at some point, if you know that that's happening, or if this is a common method for you and you know, and this is a problem, then what you often try to do is interrupt it at the beginning of the cycle. So if you know that certain things are going to cause you to feel that way, you try to preemptively stop it before it actually gets to that point, and then you're able to come up with other resolutions for it other than the explosiveness that might happen. Now this is the one that I think is probably not very helpful, but I can think of an instance when it might be something that might be necessary. So oftentimes a person might be reactive by accusing another person or have mistrust. They're yelling, there's abuse, there's crying, there's a lot of stuff that happens physically and verbally in this context. And this person that's being really reactive doesn't really have any interest in what's happening with the other person. So this is, if someone uses this and this is their primary way of dealing, then people are oftentimes tiptoeing around this person, trying to keep them from being reactive. And it doesn't really create a very happy environment for people to live in. So the other person on the other end usually ends up either avoiding or accommodating, or they may be competing with the other person, and then it ends up just causing the escalation between the two. I think the time when this might be helpful is if the other person isn't listening to you at all. If you get to the other side and you're trying to communicate with somebody and they're not listening, then sometimes I can see where reactivity might be helpful, at least to get their attention, and then hopefully you can try something else to help resolve the issue. But that's kind of the only place I can think of where this one might be helpful. Collaboration. I think this is kind of what I would consider to be the highest form of problem solving, just because you're really working to create something between the two of you. It's kind of let's both come up with ways to solve the problem, and then what you do is you kind of compromise where everybody kind of modifies their goals. I think about this with brainstorming, and the idea with brainstorming is that you're supposed to come up with ideas without judgment. And you list as many ideas as you can, and maybe you designate a certain amount of time in which to do this, and you come up with as many ideas as possible. And then you go back and evaluate afterwards. And I think that might be, this idea of collaboration. Maybe you come up with as many possible options as you can think of in this context, and then you work on evaluating them after. So there's some suggestions in here about how you might use collaboration. And one of them is to attack problems, not people. I'm just laughing because it says attach. Attack problems, not people. So that's the first one to approach. So how do I want to, let's take this on like we're both against the problem, not against each other. Focus on common interests. So what do you both share? Maybe even write them down. Write down the ideas that you both share. Write down the goals that you have in common. Write down the ideology that you have in common. Use we language. So when you're using I language, then that means you're focusing on yourself. If you use we language, it means that you're focusing on you both resolving the issue. And it's subtle, but it can be powerful. Create options. Come up with a bunch of different choices about how you might approach the issue. And then go through and then look at the ideas and say, okay, now out of all these ideas that we presented, what makes sense in this context? What might we manage or take on as an option? So I think, like I said, I think collaboration is probably the highest form of problem solving, because you're working together to help come up with a solution that maybe you hadn't thought of before, and it may be a better solution than what you had created before. I think that's the thing about brainstorming is, if you go into it without evaluating, sometimes things combined together end up being a better option, or just creating a flow of ideas. Those can be better options. So just working those ideas through can be awesome. All right, so let's go from that idea of collaboration into how let's look at how maybe men and women might handle conflict. One of the things that happens is oftentimes in culturally, in the American culture anyway, women have been taught to avoid, suppress, and sacrifice. So they're given specific ones that are kind of allowed or encouraged based on their role in the relationship. I think that's certainly changed over time. When I was a child, I think that was probably much more true than it is now. I think people have become better at it. But here's an element I think is just really huge in how communication happens. You learned communication from your family. You may have learned some from your school and from your community, but a lot of this came from your family. How do you deal with power? How do you deal with conflict? Do you take it on and do you both argue with each other? Do you walk away? I remember with my parents when I was 10 got a divorce, and I don't remember them ever yelling at each other. So whatever, I mean, I remember a closed door and them talking to each other behind a closed door, but I don't remember yelling. So that wasn't anything I learned in my family. I didn't learn to yell. I didn't learn to argue in that way. Where I've met other people and that's their primary way of dealing with things, and you're sitting there and you're watching them and they're just like screaming at each other, and it makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm not used to it. But for them, it's normal, and that's literally the way they communicate. They talk that way to each other, and that's how they resolve things. And to me, it's confusing because that's not my mode of doing it. So I think we look at this too, we have that element, and we have this with gender, but we also have it with culture. So you culturally may have been taught how to argue, and if your spouse or mate is from a different culture, you might have even additional challenges that go along with that. But I mean, when we look at it, if you get together in relationship with somebody, you come up with your own style of conflict resolution, how you guys deal with each other. Maybe it's the same as what your parents had, but maybe it's different. And so you don't know how to fight in the same way they know how to fight. So that ends up being an interesting dynamic as you start to build relationship with another person. If you're entering into an intimate relationship with somebody, how do you fight, and what does that look like, and how do you resolve those? They're all become really important just in general. So let's look at individualistic versus collectivistic. And if you remember, Americans have a tendency to be more individualistic. And a lot of Asian cultures are kind of known to be more collectivistic because they see the group as kind of being more important than the individual. But in an individualistic society, there is that idea of I agree to disagree, so that you can kind of walk away from an argument like agree to disagree. We're just going to make that decision that we're going to walk away from this, and not have a resolution. And individualistic societies have more of a tendency to compete, react, or accommodate. So we're going to have more of a tendency to do that. Collectivistic cultures might see a person arguing with them being more of a personal attack. So they might be more inclined to use avoidance or accommodation. So when we have interactions with people that aren't from the same place that we come from, you're just going to have really different ways of how you deal with conflict. And you almost need to come up with your own way. Like, let's figure out our own way. If you're going to be in a relationship with them for a long time, maybe it's a roommate that you're going to have in college, or maybe it's a roommate that you have, for the short term. You need to figure out what that looks like. Whether one person creates a structure for what that looks like, and you guys discuss and make an agreement in advance, or whatever. I mean, usually people aren't that organized. It kind of happens more an accident than it does like, let's figure out how we're going to deal with this. Yeah, no, they just go for it. But it's interesting in looking at those kind of more short-term relationships, and how do you figure out how to live with each other. mean, you're sharing a space, so how does that look? The last section, oh, wait, they have a couple more things here. So a couple of suggestions under culture would be, if you're working with someone from another culture, mediators can be helpful because some cultures, they're going to be more comfortable not dealing with you directly, and having it go through another person can be helpful. Indirect messaging, like saying things like maybe and possibly, can be helpful because you're not making a strong commitment language-wise. So it gives a little bit more room and more play in how a person might interpret what's being said. Let go if there's no perceived conflict. So if the other person doesn't see it as a conflict, then don't hold on to it like it is. Separate conflict from people. So it's kind of like what we say, look at the person's behavior as being separate from who they are. That's the same idea here. We're not going to, this conflict and this issue that we're running into is not you as a person, is the situation or the problem. And then it seems to work better oftentimes to have more assertive, direct communication. But again, this would depend on the culture. So I would, you want to kind of figure it out based on who you are relationship-wise. And I think one thing I would say to you is if you're running into a conflict situation, be more literal. I would say discuss what your communication boundaries look like up front, and maybe make them explicit, meaning that you make them clear and state them rather than have them be hidden, and then you're applying your own theory about what it looks like, and they're applying their own theory, and they won't necessarily match. So technology, I think most people agree, is not the best place for you to handle conflict. If you're just doing it like via email, you're missing nonverbal communication. So it's much better to meet the person and meet the person in person. Meet in person. And then that increases connection, and then you get the nonverbal communication and all those elements. But if you don't have the opportunity to meet in person, some suggestions you might do would be to wait. So if you might, let's just say, for example, you get an email and the email has information coming to you. And I've been known to do this. So first of all, what I might do is I might write my response out. I'm going to give you the facts. So if a student sends me an email and says that they're having this particular issue, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to state the facts. And then I might go back and I might soften it by recognizing what the situation is. And then maybe sit on it for a little bit and then reread it. If you respond back to something right away, you might be misinterpreting it, and there's just too many opportunities in written communication to misinterpret something that's being said, because you're just missing a whole bunch of communication that could be happening on the nonverbal side. Assume that the person's approaching this with the best, like they want the best in the situation. So don't approach it like this person's just a jerk and they just want what they want. So just know there could be another side to that. You might ask another opinion. I remember I was working with a student and they sent me an outline for a speech, and it was so contradictory to the normal view of things that I had to sit on it for a while. And then I went and got feedback from other people that were above me that might actually have to deal with this situation if it ended up being an issue, and just like what is the best way to approach this so that I didn't cause it. So I was prepared and I didn't cause more issue. And then, weigh the options and figure out what you think is going to be the best way to approach it. And then really look at using your competent communication to feel really, to have the best outcome. Encode your message in the best way that you can. Decode your message in the best way that you can. Seek outside words and seek outside counsel if you need to figure out, take time. Yeah, I think these are all good suggestions because, communication is just a challenge in the best of circumstances when you have conflict, and to do anything that might move you outside of that, these can be good suggestions about how to approach that. Phew. Thank you.